the New Testament. And tonight we will be looking at the second missionary journey and the first epistles. Up to this point, we've been trying to get sort of a handle on the history of Paul's life leading up to his writing. And so tonight, as you can already tell, we've got a lot to cover because the second missionary journey is a massive trip. Just by way of illustration, if you look on the left side of the screen, you will see the itinerary of that second missionary journey as Paul covered just city after city after city, and you can follow it on the map by tracing the red line and see just how many miles Paul put in during that period of something like about 3 years. It's difficult to date precisely, but something like about 3 to possibly 4 years as Paul began to preach the gospel in many of these cities. Now let's talk for just a moment, because the verses that we're dealing with here begin in Acts chapter 15 and verse 36. And they go through chapter 18 and verse 22 as Dr. Luke gives us a record of Paul's second missionary journey. They begin in Antioch of Syria. You will recall back in chapter 11, we first are introduced to that church in Antioch that is the first church that's composed primarily of Gentile converts, following the conversion of the household of Cornelius. And we read in chapter 11 of the fact that the Jerusalem church learned about the establishment of the church in Antioch, and they dispatched Barnabas to go up and work with that church. And Barnabas goes up and works with them for a while, and he sees the need for Saul, and so he travels over to Tarsus, which is Saul's home city, and he gets Saul and brings him back to Antioch, and they spend about a year working with this primarily Gentile church in Antioch. And the Bible tells us in verse 26 of Acts 11 that that's where the disciples were first called Christians. And so the Antioch church then becomes the sending church for Paul's 3 missionary journeys. And so they are the ones that commission the first missionary journey that we talked about in our last study together. And then again, this missionary journey begins also from Antioch of Syria. Now, the first missionary journey was made by Paul and Barnabas in cooperation with one another. And when they initially had left to carry out that journey, they took with them a young man by the name of John Mark. John Mark, when they reached Asia Minor, turned back and went back to Palestine. And that became the source of a controversy between Paul and Barnabas when they contemplated beginning a second missionary journey. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark. Now, I don't want to read too much into this, but it's interesting to me some things that we see in the few verses that talk about Barnabas that seem to be characteristic of his personality. And one of those things is that he is called from the very beginning an encourager. In fact, the name Barnabas, which was actually a nickname that was given to him by the apostles, means a son of consolation or son of encouragement. And he is the one, when Paul first comes to Jerusalem and tries to meet with the Christians there, and they're all terrified of him because the last time they saw him, he was trying to throw Christians in jail and persecute them and was involved in the stoning of Stephen. And Barnabas takes Saul, and he goes and he introduces him to the apostles, and he more or less vouches for him. And then later it's Barnabas who goes and gets Paul and involves him in the work with the Gentile church in Antioch. And so we get this idea of Barnabas as being someone who is willing to take you, flaws and all, and help you find a place in the work. And honestly, we could use more Barnabases in the Lord's church always. Just such a wonderful character. And so I tend to think, and this is just my opinion, you don't have to agree with me, but I tend to think that we see Barnabas's characteristic of being an encourager coming through here, that even though John Mark had turned back really at the beginning of the first missionary journey, he's willing to give him a second chance and wants to take him on the second journey. Paul does not. In fact, Paul is so adamant about the fact that he does not want to take John Mark that ends up causing a rift between Paul and Barnabas. at least to the extent that they agree to divide up and go on separate missionary journeys this go round. And so Barnabas takes John Mark and goes on his own missionary journey, and Paul takes a man by the name of Silas or Silvanus. He's also called Silvanus throughout the New Testament. And Silvanus or Silas becomes his traveling partner, although Timothy also goes with him, and apparently Luke as well. And so they set off on this journey, and at first they retrace some of the route that they had taken in the first missionary journey. They traveled through Cilicia, which would be Paul's home district, where his home city of Tarsus is located, over the Taurus Mountains and into the southern part of Galatia, northern part of Lycia, and they begin to visit cities of Derbe and Lystra that they had visited before, on up to Antioch of Pisidia that they had visited on the first missionary journey. But this time, instead of turning south and down to the coast in Lycia, they travel northwest. And they end up in a place that your Bible probably calls Troas, which is not wrong, but we probably know it better by another name. What's the other name? Troy. Troy, as in Helen of Troy and the Iliad and the battle, between Hector and Achilles and the Trojan horse and all of that. That's the Troy that Paul arrives at on the coast of Asia Minor, right up there in the very northwest corner. Okay, and so this is a place that is steeped in history, and especially Greek legendary history that takes place here. And Paul is there, and he meets with the church there, and then he does something that's never been done before. He travels across over into Europe and begins to preach the gospel in Europe. And so when Paul leaves Troy and goes to the island of Samothrace and then to Neapolis, and from Neapolis into the next door city of Philippi, and begins to preach in Philippi, and we read about that in Acts chapter 16. As far as we know, he's the first one to take the gospel into Europe. But this is not only Europe, because Europe entails a whole lot, not only in terms of territory, but in terms of culture, in terms of variety of types of people, languages, you name it. But this particular part of Europe is an incredibly important place, because where Paul is going to spend the balance of his second missionary journey is going to be traveling through Macedonia and Achaia, which make up the Greek peninsula. And he's going to be traveling through some of the chief cities of the Greek peninsula, which are not only steeped in history, but these places are among the most important cities in the ancient world. And the reason I say they're among the most important cities in the ancient world is because these are some of the most advanced cities educationally in the ancient world. In terms of technology, they're some of the most advanced. In terms of the idea of ideas, the spreading of ideas, the discussing and weighing and evaluating of ideas, these places are the cradle of Western philosophy. These are places where there's a lot of wealth. There's wealth because there's a lot of commerce. But where wealth and commerce are, you also get a great mixture of peoples who are traveling here and there and yonder by virtue of the commerce. And so what you begin to do is you begin to spread an idea like the gospel in these cities that are teeming with traveling people who are here many times because of commerce, and then maybe they board a ship and go across the Mediterranean Sea to some other place, and you have the opportunity to touch the minds and hearts of people who can take the ideas that they learn from you and they can spread it to places all around the ancient world. And that's exactly what Paul is doing as he's traveling through the Greek peninsula. And so it is literally impossible to overestimate the importance of this second missionary journey, because it gives Paul the opportunity to preach the gospel to people in these thriving, bustling cities who can take it all over the ancient world, and in fact, history tells us that's exactly what happened. And so this is if you were planning strategy to try and disseminate an idea in the ancient world that didn't have, social media and internet outlets and even print media at that time. I mean, it's 1500s when Gutenberg invents the printing press. So we're talking way before any of this. If you wanted to disseminate an idea, there's hardly any way you could possibly accomplish it better than what Paul is doing here, visiting these cities and preaching these ideas. So he goes to Philippi, from Philippi through a couple of cities and down to Thessalonica, from Thessalonica to Berea, from Berea to Athens, which had been the queen of learning for many, many years. Now, by the time Paul is there, probably the greatest center of learning in the world at the time Paul's there is going to be across the Mediterranean Sea in Alexandria, Egypt. But Athens is still not considered a lagging place in terms of intellect and spreading of ideas. And so going to Athens is certainly very impactful. From Athens, he goes to Corinth. You could hardly choose a better place than Corinth because of the commerce that's coming and going there. It's a major seaport. And so he goes to Corinth. And then from Corinth, he begins to head back gradually toward Syria. He goes to Cenchrea, then back on to the land of Asia Minor to the city of Ephesus. From Ephesus down to the seaport in Palestine of Caesarea. And then from Caesarea probably to Jerusalem and back to Antioch of Syria. All right? So many of our New Testament letters have their origin in this missionary journey. But tonight, with the time that we have left, I want to focus on two that, as far as I'm able to tell, are most likely written during this missionary journey, and those are the letters of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So if you have your Bibles, you might be interested in turning there or to Acts chapter 17. I want to start in Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 3, we have one of my favorite passages in the book of Acts. Luke records for us, now when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he visited them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you, is the Christ. Now, does anybody have old King James? Would you please read verses 2 and 3 aloud to us?
And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered, and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus whom I preach unto you is Christ.
All right. I love that particular phrasing in the King James of what Paul did. Because listen to this. He reasoned with them from the Scriptures, and King James says, opening and alleging, which is a highly accurate, by the way, translation of the words Luke uses in the Greek there. But think about this concept. What is Paul doing? He's opening the Scriptures with them. In this case, in the synagogue in Paul's day, the only Scriptures they would have had available would be the Old Testament, right? So he's opening the Old Testament and alleging, that is, setting before them. As a lawyer, when I file pleadings with the court, if I'm asking the court to give some kind of relief to my client, in order to convince the court to do what I want them to do, I am required to allege certain facts are the case that give rise to my client's right to be given relief. And so I have to put in my pleadings, this happened on this date, and this happened on that date, and this happened on this date, in order to build my case to convince the court to give the relief I'm asking for to my client. All right? That's essentially the same train of thought as what Paul is doing here. He's opening up the Scriptures and showing them the pattern that the Old Testament prophecies laid down for who the Christ would be, and then alleging, he's testifying as it were, this man who lived in Palestine not so very long ago, fulfilled all of these prophecies. And he is the Christ, and he is the one whom you should obey. Well, he has a big impact. Now, when we think about the impact that he has, I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. He preaches for 3 Sabbaths in the synagogue. However, I am by no means convinced that he only spent 3 weeks in Thessalonica, and there are several reasons I'm not. For one thing, in his first letter to the Thessalonians, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 9, Paul makes reference of the fact that while he was with them, he labored working to support himself. Now, if you're only there for 3 weeks, I suppose it's possible that you could take up a quick little part-time job, but there's not a whole lot of necessity to labor to support himself in the way that would establish a pattern of conduct. And that's what he's doing in 1 Thessalonians 2:9. He's pointing to his own pattern of conduct as an example. Okay? The second reason, and the one that really I think puts the punch to it, is when he writes his letter to the Philippians in Philippians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, he alludes to the fact that the Philippians had sent gifts to him while he was in Thessalonica twice. Now that's interesting to me. First of all, the necessity for the gift is sort of explained by the fact that Paul is not taking contributions from the Thessalonian Christians. He's supporting himself by working, and perhaps having just come into town and trying to find enough business to support himself, he might have been struggling. Would make sense. And so here are these brethren from Philippi, the church that he established just before he came here, who see a need and they send to him. However, it's about 100 miles from Philippi to Thessalonica. And you can't jump in the car and put it in drive and drive 100 miles in under 2 hours. No, 100-mile trip was several days' journey. And so if the Philippians had time to learn that Paul was in Thessalonica, was residing in Thessalonica, had a need in Thessalonica, took up a collection to send a gift to him, sent it to Thessalonica, came back, took up a second collection, sent it again to him in Thessalonica. Do you see my train of thought? He was probably there quite a bit more than 3 weeks. We don't know exactly how long. But we do know that at least for 3 weeks he reasoned in the synagogue. Now, if we follow a pattern that happened a number of times in Paul's preaching, he would always start out in the synagogue, right? He would go to the Jews first because they were the ones who, by virtue of their knowledge of the Old Testament, should have been in the best position to recognize the pattern of the Messiah in Jesus. Although, in most cases, he would actually meet with more resistance than acceptance when he went to the synagogues, wouldn't he? And that's exactly what happens in Thessalonica. And so it's probably not unreasonable to conclude that he went and preached for 3 Sabbaths in the synagogue, and then, as he did in other places, turned and began to work primarily with the Gentiles, which of course always upset the Jews, which led to persecution, which led to Paul getting run out of town, which, interestingly enough, is exactly what happens in Thessalonica. And that's how he ends up in Berea. But now notice this. The Gentiles believed in great numbers, Acts 17 and verse 4. I want to suggest to you that Paul's pattern of opening and alleging is a perfect pattern for us when we're studying the Bible with people. Get them to open their Bibles. Don't make them read your Bible. Let them get their own Bible. See it for themselves. And show them from their own Bible that their own Bible teaches them that Jesus is the Christ and the plan that Jesus has to save them from their sins. That's what Paul did, and it was highly effective. And I would argue that if we do it today, it'd also be highly effective. Well, a great many of the Gentiles believe, but Paul is ultimately driven out of Thessalonica by the jealous Jews. And from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 14, we learn that the persecution didn't end when Paul got out of town. The Thessalonian Christians continued to deal with persecution, and that was one of the reasons Paul wrote to them. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 18, we learn that Paul intended to go back and visit them twice, but he couldn't for various different reasons. Now, stop and ask yourself this. Why would Paul want to go back and visit them twice? I don't think it was just out of camaraderie, wanting to go and enjoy their fellowship again. I'm sure that was an element. But I think you can glean from the Thessalonian letters that what Paul is feeling very keenly is that he didn't get as far as he wanted to in helping these Thessalonians along in learning Christianity. Now think about the background of these people. You're on the Greek peninsula. Outside of the Jewish communities that sprang up in most every center of commerce, most people worshiped the Greek idols, right? The Greek pantheon, the polytheism that the Greeks believed in. They would have been used to a very different system of religion than Judaism and certainly than Christianity. And so when you begin to take people that are coming from that kind of a background and you try to teach them Christianity, well, it's like teaching a baby to eat steak. It's not going to happen overnight. You're going to have to wean them up, beginning with milk and then food that they can easily, chew up and digest, and then gradually build them up to things that are stronger and easier, heavier to digest. Well, Paul's working with these people. He's teaching them, but he gets run out of town. And I believe it's fairly clear from his letters to the Thessalonians that Paul feels that there was much more that he wanted to teach them that he didn't have time, and so he wanted to go back. Well, he can't go back and visit them, so it's probably in Athens that he sends Timothy back to check on them and perhaps to teach them a little bit more. 1 Thessalonians 3, 1 and 2 indicates that. But we do also learn from things Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 1, 7, and then in chapter 3, verses 6 and 7, that the church remained steadfast despite the fact that they're essentially neophytes in the faith and the fact that they're being persecuted. They remain steadfast and become an example to the believers all around Macedonia. So Paul's very proud of the work that they're doing there, but at the same time he's concerned because they're new to the faith and they're vulnerable to false teaching and they're vulnerable to misunderstandings. And you're going to find that while Paul does not spend a lot of time in the Thessalonian letters on what we might call heavy doctrine, like you would read in Galatians, Romans, Hebrews, other books like that, nevertheless, he does have to correct several misapprehensions that they had. Some of them apparently fixated on the idea of the return of Jesus. So much so that it appears from the First Thessalonian letter that some of them had quit their jobs and were just sitting back and saying, hey, I'm just going to sit here and wait till he comes. And of course, idle hands are the devil's playground, right? And the longer they sat idle, the more trouble they got into. And Paul said they had become busybodies and tattlers getting into other men's matters. And he said what they needed to do was go back to work and live their Christianity, working day by day. And in fact, he became so adamant about this that he tells the Thessalonians, if any man won't work, neither let him eat. That got quoted to me by my dad a whole lot growing up. Did y'all's dads ever do that? When I had chores to do, and of course, I was a teenage boy, I was hungry all the time, so, hey, Dad, I'm hungry was my favorite phrase. And Dad's response was usually, did you take out the trash? Something like that. No, sir, not yet. If any man won't work, neither let him eat. I knew what that meant. I had chores to do if I wanted something to eat. But no, Paul's making a point there, right? And he's teaching them to be diligent in their Christianity and not to take the idea of Christ's return and misapprehend what that means for their lives. They also had a problem with the idea of what about those who died before Jesus came back? And it seems from reading what Paul wrote to the Thessalonians that they had the idea that if you died before Jesus came back, you would just miss out on the resurrection. And so Paul writes and corrects them of that and has to deal with some of their issues with that. I want to go back for just a moment, though, and look at the city of Thessalonica because it's a very interesting city. As best we know, and there's some dispute about this, but as best we know, the city was actually founded in 316 BCE by Cassander. Do you remember when we were talking about Alexander the Great and his generals, Cassander being one of those? Well, Cassander was one of those main generals who ended up being over Macedonia, he evidently founded this city on the foundation of prior settlements and named it Thessaloniki after his wife. Always a wise move, guys. Name things after your wife. But he does. He names it Thessaloniki after his wife, and it becomes one of the chief cities. Now, it's very strategically located by the time of Paul. Number one, it's on a very well-sheltered port in a bay there, as you can see, off of the Aegean Sea. But by the time of Paul, the Ignatian Way, or the Via Ignatia, has been built. That is a major Roman road that runs essentially east to west across the Greek peninsula. So if you were coming from Italy and traveling east to Asia Minor, Palestine, Babylon, the Far East, any of those places, this road is a major thoroughfare. Guess what? Runs right through Thessalonica. And not only that, but it's a crossroads at Thessalonica with another major road that runs essentially north to south, north to the Danube River. Now, if you've studied much about European geography, you know that the Danube for literally millennia has been an incredibly important waterway in Central Europe. And so this road runs north to the Danube River, runs south to Athens, which at one time was essentially the capital of Greece, right? And so you've got a crossroads and a major port city. And Thessalonica becomes a very busy, bustling, commerce-filled, important city. It becomes even more so when the Romans take over the Greek peninsula, and they make Thessalonica the capital of the Macedonian province in 148 BCE. And so it's a very important city. As a matter of fact, to this day, the city of Thessalonica, which I think is now pronounced Thessaloniki. Anybody correct me if I'm wrong in the way of pronouncing. At any rate, still on that site is the second most important city in modern-day Greece. We know that there are significant archaeological finds to be made in that city because some have been unearthed. However, there's not been extremely extensive archaeological work done for the simple reason that there is a thriving, bustling city on that site today. But one thing, interestingly, that has been unearthed, when Paul was describing the way that the jealous Jews made trouble for Paul in Thessalonica, he mentions that they dragged a man by the name of Jason before the leaders of the city, and he uses a very peculiar Greek word that doesn't occur anywhere else in the Scriptures to describe the leaders of the city. And that was a point of criticism against Luke for a long time, that's just not a word that was used for leaders in the Greek world, until an engraving was found in Thessalonica that specifically referred to the city leaders using that exact term. And so it seems that Dr. Luke, who was, by the way, a stellar historian, used their own term for their own leaders, as one would do if he was very attentive to the culture of that area, and describes the things that are going on there. So you have this thriving, bustling city. Now, anybody remember how Paul described the Macedonian Christians when he writes to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 8? Does that ring a bell at all? He describes them as being in deep poverty. As a matter of fact, he uses them to kind of shame the wealthy Corinthians into following through on a pledge they had made to contribute to a collection that was being taken up for the saints in Judea. And he uses them to shame the Corinthians because he says they, out of their deep poverty, insisted on giving to this contribution. The unstated implication being, you and your wealth have no excuse for not having followed through already on your pledge. Okay? Well, that would include most likely the Thessalonians, and yet Thessalonica was not a poor city. I wonder, I'll have to get to heaven to find out for sure, but I wonder if perhaps the Thessalonian Christians continued to be persecuted into poverty by these jealous Jews that Paul encounters in Thessalonica. At any rate, I'll get to this very quickly and then we'll close. 1 Thessalonians is likely written by the time Paul gets to the very tip of his second missionary journey in Corinth. And he's writing because he is concerned about their development in the faith and also to encourage them. And probably sometime around the end of 51 to the beginning of 52. And he expresses in a number of places in that 1 Thessalonian letter how anxious he was for their development. The 2 Thessalonian letter makes reference to some persecutions that seem congruent with the persecutions that Luke describes Paul undergoing while he's in Corinth toward the end of his stay there. And for that reason, most of us have concluded that he probably wrote the second letter to the Thessalonians more or less a year later, but still in Corinth toward the end of his stay there. So somewhere along about late 52-ish, before he begins to head back in the general direction of Antioch of Syria. So we talk about this first set of letters, and while it has been a very abbreviated study, and I understand that, I hope it's whetted your appetite to dig a little deeper into the background of the Thessalonian letters, because I think you'll find, as I have, that there's some very, very fascinating letters. And incidentally, among all the letters that Paul wrote, there are many scholarly debates about whether he actually wrote them or not. Very few have ever taken issue with 1 Thessalonians in particular and said, no, Paul didn't write this. It's just so clearly Pauline in almost everything he says. Hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you so much for your attention.